my son-in-law changed the locks on my house while I was at my doctor's appointment. When I came home and found my suitcase sitting on the front porch in the rain, I thought there had to be some kind of mistake. But then I found the envelope tucked under the handle, and what I read inside gave me everything I needed to take back everything they thought they'd stolen from me. Let me back up. If you're listening to this right now, take a moment to subscribe to Warm Dad Stories and leave a comment telling me what city you're tuning in from. It helps me reach other people who might be going through something similar and feel like they have nobody left to talk to. Because I know that the cold, when you're standing on your own front porch in October and the key no longer fits the lock. My name is Albert. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years working as a senior compliance officer for one of the largest credit unions in British Columbia. I am not a man who is easily fooled. But grief does something to a person. It softens the edges you spent a lifetime sharpening. After my wife Sandra passed away from cancer 3 years ago, I became a version of myself I barely recognized. Quieter, more grateful for small things, more willing to overlook big ones. Sandra and I had one son. We named him Peter. We raised him in a 3-bedroom house in Kelowna with a backyard that backed onto an orchard. And we gave him every opportunity we could afford and several we couldn't. He was a good kid, thoughtful, a little stubborn, but kind. The kind of boy who held the door open without being asked and remembered people's birthdays. Then he met Courtney. I want to be careful here because I'm not the kind of man who blames a woman for everything that goes wrong in a marriage. That's too easy, and it's usually wrong. But I also promised myself I would tell this story honestly, so here it is. Courtney changed my son. Not all at once. Gradually, the way water reshapes stone. By the time I noticed how much of him had gone, it had already been years. The trouble started in earnest about 18 months after Sandra died. Peter and Courtney came to visit me in Kelowna on a long weekend in November. They sat across from me at my kitchen table, with a spreadsheet printed out and laid flat between us, as if this were a business meeting and not a conversation between a father and his only child. Courtney did most of the talking. She explained that they were drowning in debt, their renovation business had taken on too many projects, and their cash flow was a disaster. They owed money to suppliers, to a private lender, to 2 different credit cards at interest rates I wouldn't wish on anyone. The total, she said, was just over $400,000. Peter sat quietly through most of it, looking at the table more than he looked at me. Sandra's life insurance had paid out 14 months earlier. It was a significant policy, one we'd maintained for decades, the kind of disciplined financial decision you make in your 40s when it still feels abstract and you never imagine you'll actually need it. It was my retirement, my security. Sandra had held my hand in the hospital and told me to use it to rest, to travel, to finally stop worrying about money. But Peter was my son, and he was sitting at my kitchen table looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. So I did what fathers do. I agreed to help. We worked out an arrangement. I would use the majority of Sandra's insurance money to purchase a property in Surrey, near where Peter and Courtney's business was based. It would be registered in Courtney's name for tax purposes, she explained, because Peter had a judgment against him from an old contractor dispute and couldn't hold title. I thought it was unusual but not alarming. I trusted them. I paid in full. The house was worth $780,000, and I handed it to them the way you hand someone a gift, expecting nothing back except what they promised. A room for me in the basement suite, Sunday dinners, and the company of family in my final years. For about 8 months, it was fine. Then it wasn't. The Sunday dinners got shorter. My room in the basement started being referred to as the storage area in passing conversation. Courtney began leaving passive-aggressive notes on the kitchen counter about noise levels and thermostat settings and the smell of the soup I made on Tuesdays. Peter, when I tried to talk to him privately, would listen with a look on his face like a man watching a distant fire, present but removed. The morning everything changed, I had a routine cardiology appointment at a clinic in Burnaby. I left at 8:30, told them I'd be home by noon. The appointment ran long. I didn't get back to the house until nearly 2 in the afternoon. I pulled up in the cab, and I saw my suitcase on the porch before I even paid the driver. It was a burgundy rolling case Sandra and I had bought together for a trip to Portugal we'd taken for our 30th anniversary. It was sitting in the rain on the front mat with a handle so I could take it easily. Whoever had packed it was not without a certain cold efficiency. I tried my key. It didn't turn. I stood there on the porch for a long moment, the rain coming down soft but steady the way it does on the coast in October, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Sandra's last week in the hospital. A kind of hollow falling. The sensation of the ground no longer being where you expected it. There was a white envelope tucked into the outer zipper pocket of the suitcase. I pulled it out. My name was written on the front in Courtney's handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a brief, businesslike letter. It stated that the property at this address was being transitioned to a new arrangement, that my occupancy of the basement suite was no longer suitable, and that they had taken the liberty of packing my essentials. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, there was a handwritten note in different ink, Peter's handwriting. Dad, this is for the best. We need the space. There's a senior's residence in New Westminster that has availability. We'll handle the paperwork. I read that line 3 times. A senior's residence. We'll handle the paperwork. He was 63 years old in his mind, my son. He had decided his 67-year-old father, a man who still ran 5 kilometers 3 times a week, needed to be processed into a facility like a fey form being. Filed. What he meant, though I didn't understand the full architecture of it yet, was that a facility would be much more convenient for what came next. I tucked the letter back into the envelope. I picked up my suitcase. I took a cab to the Marriott in Burnaby because it was the first name that came to mind, and I wasn't capable of more complex decisions in that particular moment. In my room on the 6th floor, I sat on the edge of the bed for a while and looked out at the gray sky over the mountains and let the reality of it settle. Then I ordered room service and opened my suitcase to take stock of what they'd packed. Most of it was clothes, a few toiletries, my reading glasses, but tucked between 2 folded dress shirts, I found something that did not belong to me. It was a manila folder, the kind with the brass fastener at the top. It was fat, maybe 40 pages thick, and it was labeled, in black marker on the tab, with 2 words, Closing Docs. I set it on the bed and opened it. I want to tell you that I immediately understood what I was looking at. I didn't. It took me about 20 minutes of reading, cross-referencing, rereading, and sitting back with my hand over my mouth before the full picture assembled itself. But once it did, I felt a cold, precise clarity settle over me, the way it used to, when I found a discrepancy in an audit that nobody else had caught. The documents inside that folder were the internal working papers for a private sale. Someone was selling my house. Not through an agent, not through a public listing. A private off-market transaction, drafted by a real estate lawyer in Coquitlam, with a closing date set for 11 days from now. The buyer was listed as a numbered company, which is a flag I know well. The sale price was $480,000, considerably under market value, which meant someone was in a hurry and willing to take less to avoid scrutiny. The seller listed on the documents was Courtney. My name appeared nowhere. I turned to the financing section. There was a line I almost missed, buried in the disclosure schedule. Property subject to existing private mortgage registered against title in favor of 119432 BC Limited, principal balance $310,000, to be discharged at closing from proceeds. A private mortgage. On the house I paid for outright, in cash. I set the documents down very carefully on the hotel bedspread and picked up the phone and called my banker. I want to say something here about the advantage of spending 32 years in financial compliance. You develop certain instincts, and more importantly, you develop a network. People who owe you favors, people who respect your judgment, people who answer the phone on a Saturday afternoon when your name comes up on the call display. My banker, a woman named Judith, who'd worked with me for 15 years, answered on the 3rd ring. I asked her to pull the land title on the Surrey property as a personal favor. She called me back in 40 minutes. The private mortgage had been registered 8 months ago. It had been taken out in Courtney's name alone, secured against the property, for $310,000, at an interest rate that made Judith pause before she read it aloud. The lender was a numbered company with a registered address in a commercial building in Richmond, that I knew by reputation. It was the kind of operation that existed in the gray space between licensed lending and something considerably darker. I asked Judith one more question. I asked whether Peter's name appeared anywhere on the title or the mortgage documentation. It did not. That was when I understood the geometry of what had been done to me. Courtney had not put the house in her name for tax reasons. She had put it in her name so she could mortgage it without Peter's knowledge, and more importantly, without mine. She had borrowed $310,000 against an asset she did not pay for, from lenders who were now presumably applying considerable pressure for repayment. The private sale, the rushed closing date, the below-market price, it was all designed to liquidate the property fast enough to satisfy the debt and leave enough remaining to disappear with. The question was where Peter fit into all of this. The answer was in the last 6 pages of the folder, which I had initially set aside because they appeared to be personal correspondence rather than legal documents. They were printed email threads. I don't know why they were in the folder. My best guess is that Courtney had been using the folder as a catch-all for the whole project, and these had been printed for reference and never removed. Or perhaps someone wanted me to find them. I've thought about that possibility more than once. The emails were between Courtney and a man named Stephen. I don't know Stephen's last name because it wasn't in the thread, but I know he was not a business contact because the emails began with "Good morning, beautiful," and did not improve in professionalism from there. What was relevant, beyond the obvious, was a specific exchange from 6 weeks prior. Courtney had written, "Everything is moving. Close date is confirmed. Once the wire clears, I'll be in Calgary by the weekend. Peter doesn't know anything. He thinks it's a refinance. I told him Albert's name couldn't be on the title because of his credit history. He believed it." Stephen had replied, "And the old man?" "Courtney, already handled. Peter signed the care facility intake forms this morning. As soon as close happens, we file the capacity assessment. A friend of mine at a private clinic owes me a favor. Once that goes through, Albert's pension and his investment accounts transfer to Peter under the POA. It'll take maybe 3 months. Then Peter and I split and I'm done." I read that exchange 4 times. Then I put the folder on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark for a long time. She was going to take the money from the house and leave. She had a man waiting for her in Calgary. She had planned to leave Peter, but not before using him one final time as a tool to drain whatever financial resources I had left. A corrupted capacity assessment. A fabricated power of attorney. Peter, who believed his wife was managing a refinance, had signed paperwork he likely didn't read for a plan he had no idea existed. My son had not abandoned me. My son had been deceived. That changed things considerably. I turned the lamp back on. I picked up the folder and the phone and I started making calls. The first was to a lawyer named David Park, who had been the legal counsel for our credit union for 12 years and was now in private practice in Vancouver. It was a Saturday evening. He answered because I had called him in 3 cities over 3 decades, whenever I found something that needed a steady hand. I told him I needed an emergency consultation first thing Monday morning, and that I had documentary evidence of mortgage fraud, elder financial abuse, and what appeared to be a conspiracy to wrongfully obtain power of attorney over a mentally competent senior. He said, "Albert, I'll see you at 8. The second call was to my family doctor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ewan, whom I'd seen for 11 years. I left a message explaining that I had reason to believe someone would soon be attempting to file a fraudulent cognitive capacity assessment against me, and that I needed a current, formally documented evaluation of my cognitive function as quickly as she could arrange it. She called me back within the hour. She could fit me Monday at noon. The third call I made was not to a professional. It was to Peter. He answered on the second ring. He sounded surprised to hear from me, which told me he hadn't known exactly when Courtney planned to execute the lockout. There was something in his voice, underneath the careful neutrality he'd adopted over the past couple of years, that sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for a long time. I didn't tell him everything. I told him I'd found some documents that concerned me, and that I'd like to meet with him privately before I took any formal steps. I told him to come alone. He arrived at the hotel the following morning at 9. He looked worse than I'd expected. He was 41 years old, and he looked 50. He sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the mountains for a moment before he looked at me. I slid the printed emails across the table. I watched my son read. I watched his face go through several stages of something that started as confusion and moved steadily toward devastation. When he got to the exchange about Calgary and Stephen, his jaw tightened. When he got to the part about the capacity assessment, he set the papers down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through his nose for a long moment. "She told me the refinance was to consolidate business debt," he said finally. "She said we needed you off the title temporarily because of some issue with your ID documents at the land registry. I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't look closely enough. I signed things because she told me to and I trusted her." "I know," I said. "I know you did." There was a silence between us that held a lot of things neither of us knew how to say directly. Then Peter picked up the papers and squared them into a neat pile, which is a habit he's had since childhood whenever he needs to feel like something is in order. "What do you need from me?" he asked. That was the moment I understood that my son was still in there. By Monday evening, David Park had reviewed every document in the folder and run a title search and corporate registry check that confirmed everything I'd pieced together in the hotel room. The numbered company holding the private mortgage was connected, through 2 layers of numbered holding companies, to a licensed private lending outfit with a complaints file at the BC Financial Services Authority that ran to 11 pages. They were not violent people, but they were aggressive and they operated in ways that consistently tested the boundaries of the Mortgage Brokers Act. David's view was that we had 3 strong avenues: a complaint to the BCFSA regarding the private lender's conduct, a civil claim against Courtney for fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty, and a report to the RCMP's Financial Crime Unit regarding the mortgage fraud. I told him to begin preparing all 3 simultaneously. I also told him there was a 4th thing. The closing date on the private sale was 10 days away. Courtney was expecting a wire transfer that would pay off the private mortgage, leave her with whatever equity remained, and let her drive to Calgary before anyone understood what had happened. What she did not know was that the property could not close without clear title, and clear title required the discharge of that private mortgage, and the private mortgage could only be discharged with the lender's consent. I asked David what it would take to buy that debt. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "You want to become her creditor?" "I want to hold the paper," I said. "Same as what she did to me, only legal." Private lenders in that space operate on a simple calculus. They want their money back plus interest, and they want it now rather than later. They have no particular loyalty to the borrower. If someone offers them the full principal plus a premium for immediate settlement, they sell. David called their legal representative Tuesday morning and had a conversation that took less than 20 minutes. I authorized the transfer from my private investment account. The account Courtney had no idea existed, the one I'd built quietly over 30 years of careful investing and had never mentioned to anyone except Sandra and my accountant. And by 3 in the afternoon, I held an assignment of the private mortgage. I was now Courtney's creditor. The property could not close without my approval. At noon on Monday, Dr. Yoon had administered a full cognitive screening, and on Wednesday morning, a geriatric psychiatrist at Vancouver General, named Dr. Harpreet Singh, conducted an independent assessment at David's request. I sat in a bright examination room and answered questions for 4 hours. I recalled dates, reversed number sequences, analyzed spatial patterns, discussed current events, and explained the structure of a standard mortgage-backed security for good measure. Dr. Singh shook his hand when it was over and told me my results placed me in the top percentile for my age group across every domain they measured. The certificate of cognitive competency was signed and notarized by Thursday morning. Courtney did not know any of this. What she knew was that she had 10 days to close a private real estate transaction, that her husband had been told his father needed supportive care, and that an intake form for a care facility in New Westminster was sitting in a file at a private clinic waiting to be activated. She knew that the man she had locked out of his own home was 67 years old, recently widowed, with no family lawyer on record, and no reason to be anything other than confused and compliant. She invited me for coffee on Thursday afternoon. I know this because Peter told me she'd suggested it, framing it as a chance for everyone to talk things through. He relayed the invitation without inflection, but I could hear in the careful neutrality of his voice that he understood what it was, a maintenance call. She wanted to confirm that I was still manageable. I agreed to meet her. The cafe she chose was in White Rock, not far from the house. It was the kind of place with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu, and the low hum of an espresso machine running constantly in the background. Courtney was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 lattes and an expression of practiced warmth. She was wearing a gray blazer and had her hair pulled back, the way she dressed when she wanted to project competence and calm. She stood and embraced me, which she had not done voluntarily in at least a year. I let her. I sat down. She asked how I was finding the hotel. I told her it was comfortable. She made a brief, sorrowful sound and said she hoped I understood that the transition had been difficult for everyone, that the house situation was complicated, that she and Peter cared about my well-being above everything else. She said the word well-being with a particular emphasis, as if she were placing it gently on the table between us. Then she produced a manila envelope from her bag and slid it across to me. Inside was a document from something called the Sunrise Care and Wellness Center in New Westminster. It was a residency intake agreement. There was a yellow sticky note on the first page that said, in Courtney's handwriting, "Just your signature on the last page, Dad. Everything else is taken care of." She called me Dad. I looked at the document. I looked at the signature line on the last page. I looked up at Courtney, who was holding her latte with both hands and watching me with a steady, patient expression. I reached into my jacket and produced a pen. Not my usual one, a particular pen I had purchased on Tuesday from a specialty retailer in Vancouver who served the forensic document examination community. The ink it contained was a thermochromic compound that appeared normal under standard light and at room temperature, but which degraded completely within 48 hours of contact with paper, without any external catalyst. In 48 hours, anything signed with this pen would vanish from the page as completely as if it had never been there. I signed my name on the last page, slowly and clearly. Courtney took the document back, tucked it into her bag, and said something about how much easier things would be from here. She squeezed my hand across the table. I smiled and told her I was looking forward to having less to worry about. On the way out, I held the door for an elderly woman coming in from the rain. I walked to my rental car and sat in it for a moment before I drove away. I had also, during the embrace when she greeted me, dropped a small GPS tracking tile into the outer pocket of her tote bag. I had purchased it on Amazon Tuesday evening. It was the size of a credit card and registered to an account in my name, paired to my phone, and broadcasting a live location signal that I could monitor from anywhere. I watched the signal move for the next 2 days. Thursday evening it went to the private clinic, where her contact was apparently based. It stayed there for 40 minutes, which was long enough to file the intake documents and presumably arrange whatever fraudulent assessment they were planning. Friday afternoon it went to the office of the real estate lawyer in Coquitlam, who was handling the private sale. It stayed there for just over an hour. I forwarded the location logs to David Park. David filed the civil injunction Friday afternoon. It was granted the same evening by a BC Supreme Court justice on duty for emergency applications. The injunction froze the property transaction pending a fraud investigation, citing the evidence of the private mortgage obtained through misrepresentation, the forged, or at minimum unauthorized, encumbrance of an asset purchased with third-party funds, and a concurrent complaint filed with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I did not tell Courtney any of this. What I did was accept a dinner invitation. Peter had called me Friday evening and said, somewhat awkwardly, that Courtney had suggested dinner Saturday night at a restaurant in Langley that she liked. There would be the 2 of them and, she'd mentioned, the buyers of the house, who were apparently interested in meeting the family before closing. Peter's voice, relaying this, had a particular quality I recognized from when he was a teenager trying to tell me something without actually saying it. She wants to confirm everything is in order before Monday, he said. She thinks you signed the care facility papers. I know what she thinks, I said. Dad, what are you going to do? I'm going to have dinner, I said. The restaurant was called the Grey Stone Table. It was the kind of place that used linen napkins and printed new menus daily, the sort of establishment people choose when they want to project that everything is going well. I arrived at 7:15. David Park arrived 2 minutes later. We walked in together. The table was in a private dining area at the back. Courtney was already seated, along with Peter and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were both in their 40s, dressed in business casual, and they had the unhurried manner of people who buy and sell properties for a living and have seen most things. Courtney saw me first. The expression on her face when she registered that I was wearing a suit and that there was a lawyer walking in beside me was something I will remember for a long time. It was very brief, that expression. She replaced it almost immediately with the practiced warmth she'd worn at the cafe. But for just a moment, I saw the calculation running behind her eyes. Albert, she said, standing. I'm glad you could join us. I wouldn't have missed it, I said. I sat down. David placed his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. The 2 buyers introduced themselves. The older one was named Craig. He asked how I was connected to the property, and before Courtney could answer, I told him. I purchased it, I said, in full, 3 years ago, for $780,000, with funds from my wife's life insurance policy. My son and daughter-in-law have been residing there under an informal arrangement. I was under the impression the title situation was a temporary administrative matter. Craig looked at Courtney, then he looked at his partner. Courtney said something about the title history being complex and that everything had been properly disclosed. David opened his briefcase and placed a document on the table. It was the injunction. He explained, in the measured and unhurried tone of a lawyer who has delivered bad news to rooms full of difficult people for 25 years, that the property was currently the subject of an emergency court order freezing any transfer of title pending the resolution of a civil fraud claim. He explained that any purchase agreement signed in connection with this property for unenforceable until the litigation concluded. He noted that the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit had opened a file that morning in connection with the fraudulent registration of a private mortgage against the property. Craig picked up the injunction. He read the first page. He set it down and looked at his partner and said something quietly that I didn't catch. Then he began gathering his copies of the purchase agreement from the table. We'll need to pause this, he said to Courtney, in a tone that suggested pausing was a considerable understatement. Our legal team will be in touch. Courtney looked at the injunction on the table. Her face had gone a specific kind of still. This is a misunderstanding, she said. Her voice was level. She was composed in the way that people who have been planning something for a long time are composed when the plan first begins to visibly fail, before the reality fully lands. Courtney, I said, and something in my voice brought her eyes to mine. I found the folder. A silence. I read the emails, I said. I know about Stephen. I know about Calgary. I know about the clinic and the capacity assessment. I know about the numbered company and the $310,000 registered against the property I paid for. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a single sheet on the table. It was a printout of the email exchange between her and Stephen, the one about Peter, the capacity assessment, and the plan to drain my accounts through a manufactured power of attorney. I slid it toward Peter. My son had already read these emails, of course. We had gone over them together in the hotel room. But there is a difference between reading something in private and watching your father lay it on a table in front of the person who wrote it. Peter picked up the printout. He read it again. Then he set it down very carefully and looked at his wife. What followed was not the explosive confrontation you might expect. Courtney was not a person who shouted or wept in public. She gathered herself. She picked up her purse. She said, in a voice that was almost entirely steady, that she thought it would be best if she spoke to her own lawyer before continuing this conversation. She left. The buyers, Craig and his partner, had already gone. The server came to ask if we were ready to order, and David told him we'd need a few more minutes. We did not ultimately order dinner. Peter and I sat at the table after everyone else had cleared out. The restaurant moved around us, quiet conversations and the clatter of dishes, and we sat there for a while in the way that people sit when something large has just shifted and they are waiting to see what the new shape of things will be. "I'm sorry, Dad," Peter said. "I know you are," I said. "I should have looked more closely. I should have questioned things earlier. I should have, Peter." I put my hand on the table between us, not quite touching his. "You believed someone you were supposed to be able to trust. That's not stupidity. That's just marriage, at its worst." He looked out the window at the lights on the street. "I didn't know what she was planning with your money," he said. "With the pension. I need you to know that." "I know that," I said. "The emails made it clear. She needed you to sign the care facility forms because the power of attorney application required a family member's initiation. You were a tool in her plan, not a participant." He nodded slowly. That distinction seemed to matter to him. What followed over the next several weeks was the legal process doing what legal processes do, slowly, thoroughly, and without drama. Courtney had retained a lawyer, but found herself in an increasingly difficult position. The RCMP investigation into the fraudulent mortgage registration moved forward. The BC Financial Services Authority launched a parallel inquiry into the private lending company. The clinic where Courtney's contact worked was referred to the College of Physicians and Surgeons for an investigation into what appeared to be a pattern of capacity assessments, prepared for financial planning purposes rather than genuine clinical need. The intake agreement I had signed at the cafe, of course, was blank paper by the time anyone looked at it. I had never mentioned the pen. There was no need to. The injunction on the property held through the winter. The civil proceedings moved slowly, as they do, but David had filed a constructive trust claim on my behalf, arguing that the property, having been purchased entirely with my funds, constituted an asset held in trust for me, regardless of how title was registered. The legal theory was sound. The documentary evidence was extensive. David was not optimistic by nature, but he was confident, which in a lawyer of his experience amounts to the same thing. In March, Courtney entered into a negotiated settlement. The terms required her to consent to a transfer of the property title back to my name, to repay the costs of the injunction proceedings, and to cooperate with the RCMP investigation to an extent that her lawyer had presumably explained would be in her best interest. She did not go to Calgary. She moved into a rental in New Westminster, and, as far as I know, Stephen in Calgary remained in Calgary. I moved back into the house in Surrey in April. It is a good house. I planted tomatoes in the back this summer. The garden needed some attention after 2 years of neglect, but it came back. Things do. Peter comes for dinner on Sundays. He is in the middle of a separation that has been painful in the way separations are, especially when you look back and can identify the moment where things were already broken, but nobody said it aloud. He is going to be all right. He is my son, and he is, underneath everything, a good man who made the mistake of trusting the wrong person for too long. I made the same mistake. The difference is that when they left me standing on my own porch in the rain, with a suitcase and a changed lock, they put that folder in my bag, and everything I needed to take back what was mine was inside it. I think about that sometimes, on the evenings when I sit on the back porch with a cup of tea and watch the light go down over the mountains. Sandra would have found the whole thing remarkable. She would have said something dry about it and then made me laugh, and the laugh would have been worth more than any of the rest of it. But I also know that she would have told me what I now tell anyone who asks why I didn't just let it go. You do not let people treat you like something to be managed and discarded. Not by strangers, not by family, not by anyone, and you are never too old, and never too tired, and never too alone to remind them of that. Take care of yourselves, and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I read everyone.